I'm Alastair Lichten. I'm a campaigns officer at the Nottingham Secular Society, where I focus on education, primarily education, also human rights, and also public understanding of secularism. For those of you who don't know, the National Secular Society is a national organisation established 150 years ago. We campaign for a secular democracy where all citizens, regardless of their religion or belief, are treated equally without privilege or discrimination, and when everyone's human rights are respected equally. As I said, we've been challenging religious privilege now for 150 years, and we've changed a lot in that time, as society has also changed in that time. Education has always been an important part of, and indeed today is the most important part of our work. Within modern life, secularism is the area of public life in Britain. So education is the area of public life in Britain where a lack of secularism most impinges on ordinary people's rights and freedoms. There's no other area of public life where the widespread discrimination in law we can see through faith schools there's nothing comparable for it. Obviously there may be for individual people's specific circumstances, but in terms of a broad effect of the population, education is where it's going to be. My presentation today, as mentioned, is going to focus on the government's proposed changes to faith-based free schools, and I'll be drawing heavily on this recently updated campaigns briefing on the faith schools proposals, which goes through what the proposals are, background and history, and some of the stuff you can do to take action and get involved on that. There's copies of these. You can find them pretty directly from our website, secularism.org.uk, and I'll talk about some of the calls to action in that briefing pack. Although talking about these changes to the education system is impossible to do, these proposed changes to academies and free schools is impossible to do without taking a look at the wider context of the education system and how we got here today. The UK is a strange country, and for better or worse, there's no national institution or system that if we were starting from scratch would be exactly as it is today. Sometimes you can feel like you need a specialist history degree to unravel what's going on and how we got here. And it comes as no surprise that the same thing can be said about education. So we often speak with politicians, elected, unelected officials, and what comes across often is a sense that they do agree with us, and often they will even say, well, yes, if we were starting from scratch, of course we wouldn't have faith schools. And then go on to treat faith schools as if they are sort of an inherent fact of nature. And even MPs who are quite critical of faith schools and opposed to increasing and all discrimination have this sort of mental block that but they're just part of the education system. Without having a detailed history lesson, this goes back to the 1944 Education Act, which is known as the Butler Act, and that for the next 70 years cast a very long shadow over education in England and Wales. Whereas we've got further on Wales to a lesser extent with devolution. The 1944 Act, which is known as the Butler Act, was a result of political and religious compromises at the time. Obviously, Britain was fighting World War II. We were going through a process of enormous industrial and just population changes. And the Butler Act set up 3 categories of schools. Voluntary aided schools, where a religious foundation would appoint the majority of the governors. Voluntary controlled schools, where a religious foundation would appoint about a quarter of the governors. So you see more faithy faith school, less faithy faith school, community schools where religious foundations wouldn't appoint any of the governors and they were meant to be run for the community. The Church of England had played a historic role in education in the country up till then and going onwards. So it set up many voluntary schools, but the role of the Church of England and the role of the state was changing. That was driven by changes in society, more people, more complex industries, the economy changing, needing to have like a proper state system of education. And the Church of England at that time basically gave up absolute control of its schools in return for less control but over more schools. So under the 1944 Butler Act, it introduced religious education, which at the time was referred to often as religious instruction, and that was basically very based on proselytization. The view of Britain, at the time, which the reason at the time they wrote into law that religious education needed to emphasise Britain as a Christian nation was going through World War II, and at that time a lot of people were starting to fear that Britain wasn't a Christian nation, so they really wanted to get it written into law. So I introduced with every school in the country needs to have a daily act of predominantly Christian collective worship, and religious education when it's emphasised the Christian nation of the Christian character of the nation. There were obviously through the latter half of the 20th century other enormous changes in education, getting rid of grammar schools, secondary moderns, etc. But in terms of those three categories of schools, that was pretty much fixed. Then we getting much closer to modern day, away from history. The next big change for this, again driven by social changes, we're becoming a less and less religious in the country, and also a much more religiously diverse country. You have the problem of, if the state's going to fund faith schools, church and faith schools and Catholic faith schools as well, what about all these other religious groups who are beginning to argue for having faith schools of their own? And so the government effectively started having to fund Jewish faith schools, later on Sikh, Muslim, and also non-Anglican, non-Catholic, but other Christian denominational schools. Applications were even made in East Grinstead for a Scientology school. I think that ran into a bit of local opposition, though East Grinstead is actually quite a hotbed. Then the big change came through the introduction under Labour of academies. Academies caused lots of issues and controversial for lots of reasons which are nothing to do with secularism, but they began to move schools out of local authority control into being sponsored by organisations, and this was a mechanism to allow religious organisations, not necessarily just the Church of England and the Catholic Church, but other religious organisations, to begin running schools outside of local authority control. And this academisation then became the new thing, which is the main point that is driving all of educational changes, is this move towards academisation. And that will cast the long shadow over the next period of educational history. And so that begins to get us up to where we are today. I'll talk a little bit about the Alastair Secular Society's education work in general before I go right on to September 2016. So the National Secular Society has been described under education as an organisation which campaigns against faith schools. And although that is accurate, we don't make any bones about it. We want to see an education system which is completely free of proselytization, religious privilege, or religious discrimination of any type. But saying we're against faith schools is not entirely accurate, because what we're against is inappropriate religious privilege and religious influence in the education system. Faith schools are a very identifiable aspect of that, but it would be a grave mistake to focus just on faith schools. In some ways, the type of school matters to some extent. If you're attending a faith ethos academy, that's going to influence the sort of experience you have at the school. It might influence if there's discrimination in terms of people being hired. If you're at a voluntary controlled school versus a voluntary aided school, voluntary controlled schools very rarely have discrimination in admissions. They might have to some small extent, but voluntary aided schools, they're the ones when your parents are on religion, you can't come here. So the type of school matters, but really not as much as you'd think. It is so driven by the intentions of the local head teacher, how involved the local authority are, the local parents, the local makeup of the school, the local sacre. We hear all the time from people who are at a faith school, but it's quite light touch. And then we hear from people who are at a community school where they have prayers 4 times a day. And that's not an isolated example. We have multiple examples of that. So rather than, when we go on to what we can do in response to these changes, rather than thinking about let's get rid of faith schools, we've got to look at the whole of the educational system and the inappropriate religious influence, and think of it as a scale. From at this end of the scale, you've got the most theocratic, faith to school discrimination against teachers and pupils you can imagine. And at this end of the scale, you've got the perfect, wonderful secular school. We've got to talk about how our work is focusing on moving towards that end of the scale. And school structures are important, but not as much as you might think. So our work on education can fall into 2 areas, which is we could call casework and strategy work. So casework is often me. We have emails from parents, calls from parents, teachers, governors, occasionally pupils as well at schools, and they have an issue relating to, it comes down to inappropriate religious privilege education system affecting them and their rights. And strategic work is that the big picture moving us in the right direction. So to give you an idea of the type of casework that we typically deal with, and I'm going to go through in order from the most common type of things down to the less common type of things, and all of these will influence, we'll talk about the changes in 2016. So these change over time. We don't track it very detailed work, but you kind of get a feeling, and you see the sort of changes happening in the education system by the changing types of inquiries we get. So the most common at the moment is issues around evangelism in schools. So a couple of years ago we wrote a report on evangelism in schools, and this is focusing on the role of external groups coming into schools. Obviously, an external group coming to visit a school, and even a religious group coming to visit a school to talk about religion, can be perfectly legitimate and can have an important educational contribution to make. But you often have groups taking advantage of that access, and we call this evangelism in schools. Predominantly Christian groups, we do here other groups as well, and teachers are often very naive about these groups. They see an opportunity to enrich the school, they don't really ask the right questions, teachers aren't in any way trained or supported to ensure appropriate boundaries are maintained. So these groups coming in and effectively proselytizing, and then parents wanting and asking us, this is going on, I've just found out, or often it happened last week and I've just found out the schools aren't very good at telling, and pupils aren't very good at telling their parents what's going on in schools. So that's an area we deal with, and we advise parents on how to respond to this, and we make very clear, having a constructive dialogue with the school. We've got model policies that schools can adopt that can improve this, so that you can have religious groups in the school, but they're not acting inappropriately, not having inappropriate proselytization. The next issue is collective worship, which goes right back to the 1944 Act. The law mandates that every school in England and Wales, secular law now, has a daily act of broadly Christian collective worship. Most schools ignore this. And because most schools ignore this, lots of people think this isn't actually a problem. In fact, the government argue they don't need to do anything about it. The UN has told the government this is a breach of children's rights. But the UN said we don't need to do anything about this because most schools basically ignore this. Except lots of schools don't, and where they don't, it can cause problems. And this can be a whole scale, from 4 times a day in the classroom, in the lunch hall, at the start of the day before going home, or it can be, well, once a week we make them all pray. And so there's a scale of that. Schools are often reluctant to allow parents to withdraw from collective worship, although they have the legal right. So we have a lot of inquiries around supporting parents with that. And also, we, on a strategic level, we do speak to groups on how we can begin to challenge this. We have issues around religious education. Again, we're going down the list here, so it's not the most common thing we're contacted about. Many many people have sort of an old-fashioned idea of religious education. Religious education has improved quite a lot in the country. We are moving towards having a more non-partisan, neutral look at learning about religion rather than teaching religion. That's the general thing, but again, local schools make a difference. If you've got an RE teacher who is, who wants to teach in a proselytizing way, there's leeway for them to do that. And so parents have the right to withdraw from RE. It's not something we advocate for or against. We'd obviously like no parent to have to ever withdraw from any part of the school day, but they do have that right, and supporting parents of exercising that right is quite a big part of our casework. Staff discrimination, we often hear from members of staff. I'm an IT teacher, I'm a maths teacher, I'm working at a school, and they found out I'm an atheist, and depending what type of school it is, that can be illegal. In voluntary controlled schools, up to a fifth of teachers, including the head teacher, the school can say it's a reserved teaching post, which means you have to have someone who actively shares the religion of the founder of the school to hold that post. In VA schools, that can be 100% of teaching staff. It's very unlikely that schools will exercise that 100% of teaching staff, because to be honest with you, there just aren't enough Christians, it's predominantly Christians, there aren't enough Christians to fill those posts. But it can be a useful thing if someone is, if you're an atheist and you're criticising the school, that can be an issue. Or someone of another religion. Admissions is, a very clear area. We'll talk about it today. I would say in terms of casework that we have less than we have had in recent years, and problems with admissions fall into two categories. First category is the classic one which has existed for a long time. Parents that have a kid, they go, that school down the road looks nice. Oh, I'm sorry, wrong religion, you're not allowed in. That's that problem. The other problem we're beginning to see with the proliferation of minority faith schools is parents, we've got our kids, we want to get into that school, sorry, that school's full, you have to go to that school that is, we've advised, we've had one parent, Muslim parent, who was basically said, oh, this Jewish Orthodox school is the only school place for you. We've had Cyprus Christians basically said you've got to go to a Greek Orthodox school. Muslim faith schools, because they're not very popular, 2/3 of Muslim parents don't want to send their kids, if they have the choice, to a Muslim faith school. So there's, people are being told there's space in that school, we've got to go there. That's the two admissions things, in some ways mirror image. For most people, their local school is going to be the school they want to go to. Sex education, going down the list now, we do hear lots of issues surrounding sex education. Last year we exposed 2 faith ethos academies. These are not technically speaking faith schools, we'll come on to that sort of distinction later, teaching sex and relationship education in basically God created in one man, one woman. If you don't fall into that one man, one woman category, you don't do so much. That can be quite harmful. The UN, CRC, United Nations Committee on the Rights of the Child, has again told the UK that they are failing in their legal obligations to children's rights by not having proper, good quality sex and relationship education in schools. Again, it varies wildly between schools. And another additional issue with sex and relationship education not being statutory is schools often will turn to outside groups to provide it, because if it's not statutory, the school's already under a tight budget. An outside group says, we're coming and teach sex and relationship and with other things, and then that group's got a religious motivation, that can cause problems. So that's most of our casework. Our strategic work focuses on reform of religion and belief education in schools. We are very active in the RE reform community, and within the academic community about religion and belief education, consensus is moving in quite a secular direction actually. Almost all professional bodies now recognise that we've got to move away from proselytisation-based RE towards non-partisan teaching of contemporary religion and belief issues. We recently had a productive meeting with senior civil servants in Wales who are working on their RE reform. Unfortunately, the government are not taking, it's academic and educationalist consensus moved in one direction, the government are leaving that quite away. So we are working on a big strategic level on building a case for reform of youth education. Research is an important part of our role, so that we use a variety of research tools. We have support from volunteers often on projects, and we rely on hearing from members as well to point out issues we should be looking at. Lobbying, campaigning, meeting with, writing to government, really making the case wherever we can. One strategic area we are working on quite a lot at the moment is multi-academy trusts, which are a feature of academisation, and how they are being used by religious groups to take over more and more of the education system. So through multi-academy trusts, we're not necessarily creating more faith schools, but we are creating more religious influence over ordinary schools. For example, in Newcastle, you've got 4 community schools and 1 religious school, and the government decided they've got to put together a new multi-academy trust. Can anyone guess? So 4 community schools, 1 religious school. Of course, it'll be a religiously controlled multi-academy trust, which will take those over. Which brings us right up to 2016. September 2016, we had a surprise announcement heading up to the Conservative Party conference. We had an announcement it was leaked the day before, but it's effectively Theresa May's policy, no consideration for what plans we had that week, announcing a whole raft of changes to new faith-based academies and free schools. Very interesting that this is driven from the Prime Minister's office. This is the Education Secretary is not particularly infused by this. This is being driven by Number 10, particularly by the Prime Minister's Chief of Staff, who has had a long-held ambition to increase the numbers of Catholic-based free schools and academies. The changes are, the one most of you probably have heard the most about is the scrapping of the 50% cap on religious-based admissions to new faith-based free schools. Some of the other changes, which may haven't caught as much attention, are in some ways a bit more difficult to explain, a bit nittier, but are in some ways as important, if not more important. There will be a new requirement on schools to prove that there is demand for a particular faith school from parents of other faiths. So you need to prove that you want to go to that school, and that school can open and not allow you to go there. Encouraging twinning arrangements with other schools of either different religions or none, and encouraging mixed multi-academy trusts. So that's multi-academy trusts that are a mixture of faith and non-faith schools, always headed by a religious organisation, almost always. And encouraging faith-based academy trusts to have a member or director of a different faith or no faith on the board of directors. So I'm going to go through these 5 changes and just a little bit about them. The first, which is the scrapping of the 50% cap, I think that if you care about religious discrimination in faith schools and school admissions, it's obvious why this is a bad idea. I'm not going to, a little history on the cap. The cap was the only meaningful, it's the only thing the government have ever done since the start of state education to do anything about the problem of religious discrimination and resulting segregation in faith schools. It was, the policy came about as a direct result of race riots in North of England and very poor community relations between different groups, and this emerging self-segregation and also segregation driven by school choice in lots of the inner city areas. The 50% cap, how it works, because there's a lot of deliberate misrepresentation about the cap. A lot of people trying to campaign against it present it as, oh, you're only allowed to have 50% of these pupils, of pupils from your religion in school, so you're discriminating against your religion. So that's exactly not how it happens. The 50% cap means that 50% of your school places you can fill with people based on their parents' religion. And then the other 50% of school places need to be assigned equally to people regardless of their religion. So, for example, say you've got a Jewish free school, 50% of those places will automatically go to children of Jewish parents, And then if your child is a Jewish parent, you've got an equal chance with the other 50%, so you're not disadvantaged in any way. The government have proposed basically just scrapping that, and it will allow new faith-based free schools to discriminate in 100% of the cases. So, ironically, the director of the Catholic Education Service had an article in the Times Educational Supplement this week saying how terrible he thinks 100% mono-faith schools are. The Catholic Education Service is the principal organisation advocating for these changes. The government puts forward two arguments for getting rid of this cap, and we need to acknowledge these arguments. The first is that the cap hasn't really worked. They say the cap hasn't encouraged integration. That's absolutely not true. The evidence says that where the 50% cap is in place, it has encouraged integration in certain types of faith-based free schools. But when they say that, they're talking about minority ethnic schools. They say this hasn't encouraged integration. And that is where there is a good point. Even if you have a 50% cap on faith-based admissions to a Muslim school, there is no demand for these Muslim schools. Their demand, Muslim religious leaders want them. There are 1/3 of Muslim parents who would like to send their kids to them, but there's a very low demand for them. And that leads to people being assigned there that don't want them, trying to get out, and that means these schools are effectively 100% of one religion. With minority religions, you have the added thing that basically leads to ethnic segregation as well. Hindu, Sikh, and Muslim schools are all above 95% black ethnic minority pupils, which is bad for lots of ways. You're segregating these people into one group, and then that means community schools are less integrated. So people in community schools are not getting the ability to interact with and grow up with people from different cultural and religious backgrounds as well. So I was doing this summary of changes. The second change, which is the prove that there is demand for school places for parents of other faiths. And I've already explained the key problem with this. You want to have a school that just completely blocks people from other faiths applying, and to do that you need to prove that they want to go there. I mean, it's kind of like saying, well, you can have a whites-only bar as long as you prove there's a few black people that would love to come in. It's ridiculous. This requirement could potentially, if properly enforced, and that's prove that there's demand, you can run a consultation to find anything that you want. There's there's absolutely no difficulty. If it's just the same thing it's been for a while now, just say you're write on the application form, we'll be inclusive. Do that and you get through. You have pretty much a vanity consultation. You get a few people say, oh yeah, we'd love to be there, and then that's showing demand, then this is useless. If this is strongly enforced, and local campaign groups can force them to show, yes, there really is demand here for this type of faith school, and they can't demonstrate that, that could potentially cut off new faith schools. Unfortunately, it will probably be disproportionate. We will likely see a lot of Muslim, Hindu, Sikh faith schools blocked on these grounds, whereas Catholic and Christian faith schools, which are Catholic and Anglican faith schools, which there is more demand for, will probably clear this hurdle a lot easier. There's also the particular trick which, the bad argument which is often used for faith schools is people demonstrate that there is demand for a good school there. And then they say, our faith school is going to be a good school. But they're not demonstrating that there's demand for their faith school. So for example, Theos is a Christian think tank, does this quite a lot. They demonstrate there's demand for a particular service which is run by Christian groups. They demonstrate there's a really good demand for chaplaincy and pastoral care services. But they never demonstrate that the demand is for discriminatory faith-based ones. They just, that's what gets left behind. So this could be an interesting one, this on demonstrating local need, and that's an area where local groups potentially can get involved, can find out about consultations, can respond to consultations, can submit evidence to consultations, can be speaking to their regional school commissioners, undermine the case for, saying, no, we don't want a new faith school here, we want a new good school that's going to serve everyone. The third thing, which is encouraging twinning arrangements with other schools of either different religions or none. This is a bit more of a wishy-washy thing, to be honest with you. In some ways, it's hard to say it's a bad thing. I mean, say we have different schools going to, have after-school trips with people from, let's say, the Muslim school and Jewish school going to go to the cinema together. In some ways, that sounds like a good idea, but you're just reinforcing difference in that sense. I mean, having a foreign exchange trip of some sort is no comparison to just, meeting at the school gates. Sharing lunch. When we talk about the school gates, we're not just talking about pupils. Parents of different faiths and beliefs meet at the school gates when their children go to school together. That's, it's an intergenerational social integration, social cohesion thing of having properly inclusive schools where people are educated together. So this twinning arrangements, it's unclear what form they're going to take. It's unclear if there'll be any influence at all. It's just, you can have your completely discriminatory school as long as you, go bowling once a month with this other completely discriminatory school. Encouraging mixed multi-academy trusts. So a multi-academy trust is a group of multiple academies working together. The multiple academy trust can be just one academy, confusing. And a mixed one is when you've got a mix of religious and non-religious schools. In that case, basically, religious influence increases across the board. In the rare case that a religious school enters a mixed multi-academy trust, its religious ethos has to be really strongly protected. Needless to say, in the much more common case, when a non-faith school enters a faith-based multi-academy trust, there is no protection at all. Caroline Smellman, the second Church Estates Commissioner, did us a massive favour, I think 1 year ago. She brought up an example of this to say, look, it's fine, it's fine community schools going into this, into mixed academy, multi-academy trust. It worked great with these pilgrim schools in Norfolk. And then we looked at them and all of them had been taken over and changed into faith schools. So we thanked her for the example, which we've then gone on to use quite a lot. Encouraging faith-based academy trusts to have a member or director with different faith or no faith on their board. One of the principal ways in which the religious ethos of faith-based schools is maintained is by requiring governors, trustees, board members, depending on terminology, to be of a certain faith. Requiring having a token member of another religion or of no religion is not, it's still problematic. You're still saying that people should be appointed as governors based on their religion or belief. You're going to get people who are basically, you're going to get faith-based education enthusiasts. So the Christian school will get a Sikh governor who really wants there to be lots of faith schools, and the Sikh school will get a Christian governor who really wants to be lots of faith schools. That's not challenging, that's not providing the proper oversight. Also, all of these were, I've said, encouraging, because these are completely unbinding, the government can't enforce them. All of these changes, which I've told you about, and I'll get on to how you can challenge them, your MP can't vote against these changes. None of these changes require any changes in law. This is all done through funding agreements between the Secretary of State and the school. No legislative change. So the bigger changes announced, like grammar schools, you need to change the law if you want to bring grammar schools back. If you want to introduce 100% religious discrimination in schools, no legal changes needed. It's a change of policy. The Secretary of State just, when they write a new funding agreement, changes the wording on that. If they want to encourage encourage these mixed multi-academy trusts, no laws need to change on that. That's all a matter of funding agreements as well. So those are the changes, and what can we do about them? If your MP can't vote against them, we had a great thing on Twitter when one MP responded to our briefing saying, this is terrible, I will vote against this. And we had to say, that's very nice, but what do you mean? You can't vote against it. But hope is not lost. In our briefing, which goes over these changes in a lot more detail, so each change we've got what's the background to the change, what's the argument that goes before for the change, why I think it's a bad idea, what we'd like to see instead. So for example, rather than having, oh, you'll also have a member of another faith on the board, we'd like to go to the voluntary controlled model, which is only if voluntary controlled schools can be faith schools with only a quarter of governors appointed by faith, why not limit all of them to a quarter? I didn't talk about actually some of the massive structural changes to voluntary controlled schools, which I find very interesting, but might be a bit terminology heavy. But we can do that in Q&A if you want. So take action, respond to the government's consultation. As you can imagine, the questions are incredibly leading. It's how would you like us to do this, etc. But respond to the government's consultation nonetheless. There's links on our website, front page, you'll find the way through. Contact your MP and ask them to oppose the plan. They can't vote against them, but they can criticise them, they can ask questions, etc. Whenever I say write to your MP, what I mean is write to your MP twice. The reason is, you write to your MP, you will get and lots of people get very discouraged by this. It's like, I wrote to my MP and they sent me back this, MPs get thousands of letters. The first letter is almost always from you off. The first letter is, yes, this is, and there you go. The second letter is the one they actually write. If you send an MP a second letter with more examples responding to their points, that's going to have a lot more impact than a pro forma letter. People often ask us, do you have a template letter you can send to MPs? We have the briefing paper with the arguments. The reason is, if an MP gets 100 letters that all look the same, they take absolutely no notice on it. So explain to them why it's important to you, why you're opposing this. That's going to be what gets the response. Moving towards a secular education system, returning to this idea of not worrying about necessarily types of schools and this and that, but looking at the whole issue of inappropriate religious influence and privilege in the education system. How do we move there, and what are the challenges? The first is there's a concentration and a dedication gap. The polls all show, depending how you ask and what aspects you're focusing on, huge numbers of people, majority of the people in almost every way you ask the question, are opposed to faith schools. But that's a constituency, that's a coalition of people who's very diverse, who have radically different views, who aren't organised and concentrated around this issue. That's why MPs think that faith schools are far more popular than they are. MPs respond to what they perceive as powerful groups. They respond to groups that they perceive represent constituencies. That's why they respond to the groups of people who show they care enough about to write the second letter to them. If we want to move towards a more secular education system, we need to recognise also there's a huge diversity of opinion on faith schools. Some people, like me, are opposed to every aspect of religious privilege in the education system. There are some people who say, well, I'm in favour of faith schools, but I don't want them to discriminate in terms of admissions. And you could carry on arguing about the favour of faith schools, but work with them on that bit. There are people that say, well, I'm against, I'm against faith schools, but if you're going to have them, yeah, they should be able to discriminate in admissions. It's the opposite situation. Work with them on the things that they do. There's lots of people say, oh yeah, I'm okay with faith schools, but as long as they're not really pushing it too hard, well then show them the evidence of how it's been pushed too hard. The need to work a bit with faith. For example, it's Catholic Education Service and some Jewish schools are the only ones really advocating for having 100% religious discrimination in admissions. But you can, I think at times, a couple of months ago, 68 rabbis getting together who disagree on lots of things about faith schools just to oppose this thing. So where there's opportunity to work with religious people, it shouldn't, the argument against faith schools, you might be motivated by opposition to religion. I'm not saying it's in any way good or bad, but the argument against faith schools stands completely separate to any theological argument. I mean, you can have absolute definitive proof of any God you wanted, any theological claims you wanted tomorrow. Faith schools and discriminating against people based on religion is still a bad idea. We need to have national and local groups, better evidence, and we need to better educate the public. Personal experiences are important, but particularly, local groups tend to be older than the population on average, and often people have quite an outdated idea of faith schools. They may be outdated in that they imagine that Christian faith schools are sort of soft places. They don't really push religion that hard. That may have been true at one point in the past. Voluntary controlled Christian faith schools are becoming far more, and often in opposition, opposed by governors and teachers at school under law, especially far more aggressive in how to promote their ethos. If you're making arguments based on when I was at school, religious education was basically we're told this as a fact, and religious education has moved on in lots of areas, and those arguments, you need to, we need personal experience of parents being discriminated against, of pupils that have suffered through this, but we also need broader evidence base and to bring that out. We need local campaigning. I mean, it was really great to pick up Nottingham Secular Society leaflet and see local activities that are being done. The role of local authorities has been gutted in terms of education. Their powers have been pruned back dramatically, but they still do have powers. You still can get in, badgering your local authority is still as important as badgering your MP politely, respectfully, nicely. Your regional school commissioner, do you know who your regional school commissioner is? No one knows who their regional school commissioners are, but you should find out and you should write to them about every single new faith school opening. You should find out who your local newspapers are, and next time instead of putting like a puff piece of, oh, a lovely new school is opening, maybe they can put a piece in there, oh, a lovely new school is opening. And the Nottingham Secular Society have said they like a lovely new school, but this school is discriminatory. I would, say join the NSS if you can, or if you can't join as a member, you can sign up for our weekly newsletter and briefings and calls to action around things like this. So, does anyone have? I have no idea how we're doing for time, but if everyone's happy for any questions.